Hi everyone, I'm Anita Sharma and you are watching A News. Here's what's making news right now. Syrian refugees in Turkey are ready to return home as fighting in their homeland reaches the end stage. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump calls for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine following his meeting in Paris. South Korea bans the president from traveling overseas amid the country's deepening crisis. The world is watching Syria, especially those who left the country to seek refuge in Turkey during the civil war. Now, amid the collapse of Assad's government, many Syrians are finally returning to their homeland.
At the Cilvegözü border gate in Hatay, families and individuals gathered early Monday, eagerly waiting to cross back into Syria. To ensure smooth processing, gendarmerie teams managed the flow of people with an additional checkpoint set up 5 kilometers from the border. Many expressed joy and relief at the chance to return home after years in exile. Some had lived in Turkey for over a decade, building new lives but always longing for their homeland. Others described the end of the conflict as a moment of liberation and expressed deep gratitude to Turkey for its support during difficult times. Families with young children and the elderly were among those making the journey, cherishing the opportunity to rebuild their lives in Syria.
Turkey's foreign minister says there must be a fresh focus on rebuilding Syria now. Hakan Fidan describes recent developments as a pivotal moment for peace as well as stability. Speaking at the 15th Conference of Ambassadors in Ankara, Fidan called on international actors, including the United Nations, to support the Syrian people in creating a governance model that embraces all groups. He highlighted Turkey's 13-year commitment to advocate for justice and regional harmony. Fidan reaffirmed Turkey's readiness to assist Syria in navigating this new chapter.
The developments in Syria yesterday have become a beacon of hope for us. We expect international actors, especially the United Nations, to extend a helping hand to the Syrian people and support the establishment of an inclusive administration. As you know, we've stated from the very beginning that a permanent solution, peace and stability in Syria can only be achieved through national reconciliation. However, despite all our efforts and the opportunities given to them, the regime has not taken steps to reconcile with its people. Moreover, the regime's failure to respond positively to the calls made by our president, who foresaw the upcoming process, has led to developments that have proven us right. At this point, a new era has begun in Syria. Now, it's time to focus on the way forward.
Meantime, the United States promises to support Syria and its neighbors after rebel forces overthrew President Bashar al-Assad. Speaking from the White House, President Joe Biden said the United States will work with partners to help Syria navigate this uncertain period and ensure stability.
The United States has pledged to support Syria and its neighbors. Biden confirmed reports that Assad may have fled to Moscow and said he should be held accountable.
After 13 years of civil war in Syria, more than half a century of brutal authoritarian rule by Bashar Assad and his father before him, rebel forces have forced Assad to resign his office and flee the country. We're not sure where he is, but there's word that he's in Moscow. At long last, the Assad regime has fallen.
Biden emphasized this marks the first time in years that Syria is free from the influence of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. He called it a critical moment to seize new opportunities while managing risks.
As we all turn to the question of what comes next, the United States will work with our partners and the stakeholders in Syria to help them seize an opportunity to manage the risks.
After 13 years of civil war, Syrian opposition forces have overthrown President Bashar al-Assad. They seized key cities, ultimately forcing him to leave the country.
It's not clear if Biden's approach towards Syria will be shared by his successor, Donald Trump, who takes over, as you may know, in January. Our Washington correspondent, Jagruti Dev, has more.
A moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better future for their country. That's how Joe Biden described the capture of Damascus and the departure of Assad after more than 2 decades in power. Speaking from the White House, Mr. Biden said the US's actions, including sanctions against Assad's supporters, Iran, Russia and Hezbollah, had weakened them, and that this prevented them from being able to prop up the Syrian government. The president planned to speak with regional leaders and promised to support neighbouring countries in the event of any threats from Syria as it transitions. Mr. Biden's optimism also came with a warning that this was a moment of risk and uncertainty, with ISIS preparing to take advantage of the power vacuum in Syria. With that in mind, he said the US had conducted dozens of precision airstrikes targeting ISIS in Syria. The incoming Trump administration is also watching events in the Middle East closely, with the president-elect posting on Truth Social a day before the government's collapse. Syria is a mess, but is not our friend. The United States should have nothing to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved. Now, this was a sentiment echoed by his vice president-elect after the rebel takeover. J.D. Vance posted on X, as President Trump said, "This is not our fight and we should stay out of it." But despite Donald Trump's desire to stay out of Syria, he will likely have to make a difficult assessment about the extent of US involvement, given the level of existing sanctions on Syria's economy and the concerns about ISIS and the rise of opposition group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham with its previous links to al-Qaeda. Now, the Trump administration may find that taking a hands-off approach is easier said than done. Jagruti Dave for A News in Washington, D.C.
Meantime, our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova is in Moscow right now with Russia's perspective on the situation in Syria.
Russian officials say Syrians will have to cope with a full-scale civil war alone. Deputy Chairman of Russia's upper house of parliament said on Sunday that in such conditions the support will be provided if the people of Syria continue to require it. And for Russia, he said, the primary task is to ensure the safety of Russians and civilians, including diplomats and their families, but also the servicemen. In his opinion, in Syria, the hardest is ahead again. The Russian Foreign Ministry on Sunday reminded the emergency contacts of the Situation and Crisis Center Department, quote, in light of the development of the situation in Syria. Another senior lawmaker, Leonid Slutsky, said Syria's territorial integrity should be preserved. Commenting on the rebels taking over Damascus, he said an internal political dialogue was needed as well as democratic and peaceful transition of power. Syria's territorial integrity and sovereignty were also stressed by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who participated in the Astana format meeting in Doha on Saturday. And also speaking at a diplomatic forum there, he called for the immediate end to hostilities and a start of dialogue between the government and legitimate opposition forces. He also said Russian air forces have been helping the Syrian military to target the positions of terrorists. Lavrov repeatedly pointed out that HTS is listed as a terrorist group by both the United Nations and the United States. Without naming Washington specifically, Lavrov said that the opposition groups were being used for geopolitical purposes and that the offensive was geared to undermine everything Astana format has been doing. Russia has one of its largest military bases outside the former Soviet Union in Khmeimim and a naval port in Tartus. The future will depend on the new authorities' decisions, according to the Syrian Prime Minister. And the fear in Moscow is that if a political vacuum is created, Syrians might suffer a repeat of the chaos seen in Iraq in 2003 and in Libya in 2011. Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow for A News.
Thank you, Dasha. Syrians living abroad have been pouring into the streets celebrating Bashar al-Assad's fall from power. News of Assad fleeing the country after rebel forces seized Damascus ignited waves of joy and unity among Syrian communities around the world.
Across continents, from Europe to the Middle East and Australia, Syrians demonstrated their enduring hope and determination for a brighter future. In Sydney's western suburbs, opposition supporters came together to wave rebel flags and dance in celebration. Crowds hugged each other and rode horses in a vivid display of triumph as Islamist rebels declared Assad's ousting. Similar scenes unfolded in Athens, where Syrians gathered to chant slogans like "The Syrian people are one," commemorating the end of decades-long oppression. Meanwhile, in Berlin, home to nearly 500,000 Syrian refugees, the festivities carried on into the evening. Crowds poured into the streets to wave rebel flags and express their joy, reflecting the collective relief of a community that had endured a decade of war. In Libya, the streets of Misrata and Tripoli came alive with celebration. Syrians living there marked the historic moment with excitement, filling public spaces with the sound of victory and hope. In Turkey's capital, Ankara, Syrian expatriates also celebrated, expressing pride and optimism for their homeland's future.
Israeli ground forces crossed into Syrian territory for the first time since the 1973 October War. The move marks a very significant shift in Israel's policy within the region. Israeli forces advanced beyond the demilitarized zone on the Golan Heights, taking control of key positions, including Mount Hermon. Israel's Foreign Affairs Minister Gideon Saad labeled the presence of Israeli forces as temporary. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel also confirmed that Israel struck suspected chemical weapons sites and long-range rockets in Syria in order to prevent them from falling into the hands of hostile actors. A News correspondent Trent Murray is in Tel Aviv with more on Israel's response to the developments in Syria.
Well, like many countries in this region, Israel has been watching what has happened in Syria very, very closely. Israeli intelligence have been speaking here to media, saying that they themselves were surprised at just how fast Assad's forces crumbled and did not put up a fight, allowing those rebels to take the capital, signalling the end of the Bashar al-Assad regime. But here they are also concerned about their own security. We've had confirmation that the IDF has placed additional troops and even tanks up on the UN-mandated demilitarized border in the occupied Golan Heights. They say that they are doing that in order to protect the state of Israel. They say so far things are calm at the border, but we did see reports of several airstrikes targeting airfields in Syria earlier today. The IDF has not made any comment as to whether they were behind them, but it is highly likely, given that they often do operate in Syrian airspace using their air force. Now, look, I guess the real question next for Israel, but also many in this region, is with the fall of Bashar al-Assad's government, what will the new levers of power look to do in Damascus? We know that the rebels are working with the country's prime minister in order to ensure a transition, to make sure that the machinery of government continues to work and that the state operates until a new leader can take over. But of course, the question is, while there has been some scenes of jubilation in Syria from people after the end of 14 years of this civil war, will there now be anger? Will there be retribution on the ground against people that were loyal to President Assad to the end? time really will tell, but undoubtedly this is a moment of huge historical and geopolitical importance, not just to Syria, but to the entire region. Trent Murray for A News, Tel Aviv.
Thank you, Trent. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump calls for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine. This following his meeting in Paris with French President Emmanuel Macron and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump's remarks are sparking reactions globally as the war continues to claim countless lives.
President-elect Donald Trump took to his Truth Social platform on Sunday to urge an immediate ceasefire and the start of negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. This statement followed a high-profile meeting in Paris on Saturday with President Emmanuel Macron of France and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump emphasized that both Kiev and Moscow have suffered devastating losses, claiming hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been killed in a war he described as one that should never have started. The Paris meeting, held at the Élysée Palace, marked Trump's first diplomatic engagement on the international stage since his election victory. Volodymyr Zelensky, calling the talks constructive, later reiterated that any peace deal must be fair to Ukrainians and ensure lasting security.
We all want peace for us, and this is our position. We want the peace to be just for us, and that Russia, Putin, or any other aggressor would have no opportunity to come back in the future. This is what's most important, just peace and security guarantees, strong security guarantees for Ukraine. We have agreed to continue working.
The French and Ukrainian leaders pressed Trump to maintain US support for Ukraine as the conflict enters its third year. Trump's call for a ceasefire raises questions about the future of Western assistance under his leadership, with global leaders closely watching his next steps.
Turning to Taiwan, which raises its military alert as China boosts its presence near the island following President Lai Ching-te's recent Pacific trip. Tensions between the two sides continue to escalate.
China has established 7 temporary airspace zones around Taiwan. It has also deployed naval and coast guard vessels in the area. This follows the head of the Taiwanese administration's recent trip to Hawaii and Guam. China viewed the trip as a provocation. In response, China established airspace zones off Fujian and Zhejiang provinces and deployed nearly 90 ships near Taiwan. Taiwan then activated combat readiness exercises and expressed concerns over China's gray zone tactics, such as frequent air and sea missions. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin warned that China aims to disrupt the international order.
You know that this theater has been described as our pacing challenge. And I described it as our pacing challenge because the PRC is the only country in the world that has the intent and increasingly the capability to change the rules-based international order.
China defended its actions as a necessary response to Taiwan.
First of all, I would like to tell you that there is no defense ministry in Taiwan. Taiwan is an inalienable part of China's territory. The question of Taiwan is an internal affair of China, and China will firmly safeguard its national sovereignty and territorial integrity.
China claims Taiwan as an inseparable part of its territory and rejects foreign interference.
South Korea is in turmoil as protests continue to disrupt daily life. Commuters face severe traffic jams, and the political unrest shows no signs of easing just 1 week after that botched attempt to declare martial law.
Thousands of people in South Korea have taken to the streets with both supporters and opponents of President Yoon Suk-yeol and his failed attempt at imposing martial law. Traffic in Seoul has been heavily impacted, particularly for commuters coming from nearby cities like Paju. With protests blocking key routes, many are facing significant delays on their way to work.
The country is in chaos right now, and ordinary citizens are struggling greatly. In my case, I came to office from Paju, and honestly, it has become very difficult to get to work due to various issues. The traffic is in a huge jam, and I believe all of this is happening because of this chaos.
This weekend I had a very hard time, but I believe that it's the responsibility of us residents to uphold our respective roles. With the strength of our politics and our people, I trust that democracy and the constitutionalism will rise and return to stability.
South Korea's financial markets are also feeling the strain. On Monday, South Korean stocks saw their sharpest one-day decline since November, with the Kospi index falling by 1.73%. Fears of prolonged political instability have spooked investors, prompting concerns over the country's economic stability. The government has pledged to take emergency measures to stabilize the markets, but uncertainty remains high.
Well, South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol now faces an overseas travel ban as prosecutors consider filing insurrection charges following last week's very controversial attempt to impose martial law. The travel ban was confirmed Monday by the Corruption Investigation Office, further escalating the crisis surrounding Yoon. Despite narrowly surviving an impeachment vote in the opposition-led parliament last Saturday, Yoon's political future remains uncertain. Adding to the turmoil, his party has called for his resignation, urging him to step down to safeguard the nation from what they describe as, quote, grave danger.
Following a botched attempt at imposing martial.
That's all we have for you now. Thank you so much for joining our team here and watching A News. Please visit us online at anews.tv. We'll see you real soon.